What happens when power corrupts and justice falls from the hands of the unexpected? In a time when kings ruled with iron and fire, one woman stood at the edge of a tower with nothing but courage and a stone. Her name is lost to history, but her act changed everything. This is the cinematic retelling of one of the Bible's boldest moments, the woman who killed a king with a millstone. Judges 9:1-6. The wind carried dust across the valley of Shechem like whispers of the dead, silent, swift, and unseen until too late. Beneath the shadows of Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal, the city stirred in uneasy peace. But within its stone walls, a storm was already rising. Abimelech stood at the threshold of his mother's house, watching the sky burn orange with the setting sun. His dark eyes, sharp as obsidian, scanned the horizon. The land of his forefathers, of judges and warriors and prophets, had become a cradle of ambition, and he, born not of a queen but of a concubine, would seize it. He was a son of Gideon, the mighty judge who had delivered Israel from the hands of Midian. Gideon, also called Jerubbaal, had many sons, 70, born to his many wives. But Abimelech was born in Shechem, to a woman who never held the favor of the palace, never bore a title. He was the son who slept in the servants' quarter while his brothers feasted like princes. And he would not be forgotten. At 2008, Abimelech was no longer the outcast child. His shoulders were broad, his stride confident. There was a calculated fire in his words, a hunger in his spirit. And Shechem, tired of instability and tribal conflict, listened. He gathered the leaders of his mother's people, the men of Shechem, beneath the sacred oak of the pillar. Their faces were worn and creased, eyes weary from years of lawless freedom since Gideon's death. The time of the judges was crumbling. They needed a king. Abimelech's voice rang with conviction. Why should you be ruled by 70 men, all sons of Jerubbaal, when you could have one king, your own flesh and blood? The question was simple, dangerous, seductive. Whispers spread through the elders like fire through dry wheat. Gideon had refused to become king, saying the Lord would rule over Israel. But Gideon was dead, and now a vacuum begged to be filled. With silver taken from the temple of Baal-berith, they paid Abimelech's price. He hired worthless and reckless men, mercenaries with sharp blades and no loyalty, and rode with them to Ophrah, Gideon's hometown. The slaughter was swift and unspeakable. 70 brothers, sons of Gideon, were dragged from their homes. One by one, they were executed on a single stone. Their blood soaked the soil, and the people watched in stunned silence. No mercy, no hesitation, no rebellion. Only one escaped, Jotham, the youngest, who fled into the wilderness. And so the throne was claimed, not by birthright, not by honor, but by blood and fear. The day Abimelech was crowned king, the people gathered at the oak of the pillar in Shechem, the same place Joshua had once renewed Israel's covenant with God. The irony was bitter. What had once been a place of blessing was now a throne built on betrayal. The horns blew, the people shouted, and Abimelech stood before the nation, his robe heavy with new power and old guilt. He had everything he wanted, power, a crown, a name. But far in the distance, a lone voice echoed from Mount Gerizim, high above the city, Jotham, the one who escaped. His voice was like thunder, his words a parable. If you have acted honorably and in good faith, then rejoice in Abimelech. But if not, may fire come from Abimelech and consume the leaders of Shechem, and may fire come out from Shechem and consume Abimelech. Then he disappeared into the mountains, and silence returned. But in that silence, something ancient stirred, not the rage of men, the justice of God. Judges 9:22. 25. 3 years passed since Abimelech bathed Shechem's soil in blood and placed a crown upon his head. Time did not heal the land. Time only taught it how to bow in silence. He ruled not like Gideon his father, who had judged with humility and fear of the Lord, but as a tyrant cloaked in kingship. His authority was not built on righteousness, but on fear. His sword, not scripture, governed the land. In Shechem's market square, silence followed his name. Mothers held their children closer. Merchants traded in whispers. The weight of his crown pressed not only on his own brow, but on every household beneath him. He ruled from Shechem as his stronghold. Though he had no throne of cedar, no palace of marble, he wore no golden crown. His power was a blade, his scepter terror, and yet his power began to rot from within. The people of Shechem, once eager to crown him, grew uneasy. Blood was not so easily washed from the city gates. The memory of 70 sons murdered on a stone could not be buried with soil and song. In alleyways and wine cellars, rumors festered. He does not lead, he consumes. His fire burns not our enemies, but our children. And in the shadows, rebellion bloomed. A man named Gal, son of Ebed, entered Shechem like a snake in tall grass. He was a loud man, charming and bold, everything a crowd adored and a tyrant feared. Gal was not from Shechem, but in desperate times, strangers became messiahs. During the harvest festival, when wine flowed freely and caution slept, Gal stood in the gate and let his voice ring like a blade unsheathed. Who is Abimelech, that we should serve him? Is he not the son of a slave woman? Are not the men of Shechem greater than he? The people laughed, drunken laughter, nervous and loud. Some raised their cups, others looked over their shoulders. If I were king, Gal shouted, I would tear Abimelech down like a crumbling wall. I would say to him, increase your army and come out. The challenge was cast, but Shechem was not the only place filled with listening ears. Zebul, the governor of the city, loyal to Abimelech but wise enough to mask his allegiance, heard Gal's words and sent word to the king. By nightfall, a raven flew from Shechem to Abimelech's camp. The message was short, its tone urgent. Come by night, you and the men with you, hide in the fields. At dawn, rise against the city, for Gal has stirred the people against you. Abimelech's rage was swift and cold. He gathered his forces, men who had grown fat with conquest, soldiers whose loyalty had been bought in blood, and marched under the cloak of night. Outside Shechem, he split his army into 4 companies and waited in the shadows of the olive groves. The morning sun had not yet kissed the rooftops when Gal, still drunk with wine and pride, stood at the city gate. He saw figures moving on the hill and rubbed his eyes. Look, men are coming down from the mountains, he muttered. Zebul stood beside him, calm. You see shadows, nothing more, but the truth could not be hidden. Moments later, Abimelech's forces descended like wolves. The city erupted into panic. The sword of Abimelech cleaved through the heart of rebellion. Gal and his brothers fought, but they were outnumbered, outmatched, and unprepared. They were driven from the city, their blood mingling with the stones. But Abimelech's wrath was not satisfied with victory. He had smelled rebellion, and rebellion could not be treated. It had to be burned out. He waited only a day. Then he returned. This time he razed the city of Shechem to the ground. He slaughtered its people, tore down its walls, and salted the earth so that nothing would grow again. Where a city once thrived, only ashes and curses remained. This was not justice. This was vengeance. But his fire would not stop there. A handful of survivors fled to the Tower of Shechem, a stronghold built into the heart of the city's temple. Families, priests, women, and children all sought refuge within its stone walls. Abimelech pursued them without pause. He commanded his men to gather branches and dry wood. He himself chopped limbs from trees, his hands blistering from effort, and when the base of the tower was piled high, he set it ablaze. The screams echoed into the heavens. 1,000 souls perished in that inferno. Men, women, and children, all consumed beneath the king's fury. Smoke rose into the sky, blotting out the sun. The smell of burning flesh, of sacrifice to nothingness, choked the valley. Abimelech stood and watched as the flames danced, an emperor of ruin. Yet even as the ashes fell, he felt no peace. His throne was stronger, but his soul was weaker. The fire had not cleansed his name. It had only lit the path to his own destruction. Far to the north, another city watched the smoke rise, Thebez, built upon rocky ground, known for its tall, impenetrable tower. And within Thebez, a woman watched the horizon. She saw what was coming, and she would not wait to be consumed. Judges 9:45-49. The sun rose over a scorched horizon. Its golden light filtered through the veil of smoke that still hung over Shechem like a funeral shroud. The valley was quiet now. No laughter, no market calls, no music from weddings or festivals, only silence and the smell of ash. The once great city had been reduced to cinders and bones. Salt glittered where crops once stood. Stones blackened by fire sat in the places where children once played. The Tower of Shechem, once a place of refuge, now stood as a smoldering tomb for over 1,000 men and women. Their screams had faded, but the memory lingered like the aftershock of thunder. Abimelech walked among the rubble with the gait of a victor, but his eyes were hollow. He had crushed the rebellion. He had razed the city. He had silenced the dissent, and yet his chest still burned, not with glory, but with something darker, something hungry, something unfulfilled. Power was a thirsty god, and it demanded more. As his army set camp on the edge of the ruin, one of his captains approached, covered in soot and blood. "My lord," the man said, bowing low, "the city of Thebez has not submitted. They fortified their gates and sent word of defiance." Abimelech's lips curled. Another flamed to smother then. Thebez was smaller than Shechem. Its walls were not as thick, its soldiers fewer in number, but it sat high on a hill, and its people were proud. They had watched Shechem fall, and rather than be consumed by fear, they had chosen resistance. Fools. Abimelech mounted his warhorse, black as night and foaming at the bit. Behind him, hundreds of soldiers followed, seasoned killers who no longer fought for justice or nation, but for conquest and fear. Their eyes were dull, their hands stained red. Within the walls of Thebez, preparations were underway. The city's tower, built into the rocky slope, loomed high above the walls, a fortress within a fortress. Its walls were thick, its stone ancient. Generations of harvest and battle had carved it with stories, and inside that tower, a woman watched the horizon. She was not a warrior. Her hands bore the marks of grain and millstones, not sword hilts. Her name was not recorded, but her spirit would become legend. She lived simply, widowed by war, mother to a young daughter, and caretaker of the grain house near the tower's base. Her face was marked with the sun, her eyes dark and deep like olive pits. When the word came of Shechem's fall, she did not weep. She prepared. She sharpened her senses like a blade. She gathered the children, the elders, the frightened, and led them into the tower as the city gates were sealed. From the top of the tower, she could see the dust rise in the distance. Abimelech was coming, and so was judgment. By noon, the city was surrounded. Abimelech's forces swept through the outer districts like wildfire. The defenders fought bravely, but they were outmatched. One by one, the streets fell. Bodies lined the stone roads. The cries of the wounded echoed through the alleys. But the people did not scatter. They fled to the tower. Men, women, children, all packed into the stronghold that stood tall in the center of Thebez, its base encircled with stone, its height offering the last breath of hope. Abimelech dismounted, his boots crushing gravel as he strode toward the tower's entrance. His hands were blistered from swinging axes, his eyes bloodshot from smoke. He saw them gathered in the windows, dozens of eyes staring down at him, some in fear, others in defiance. He spat on the ground. "Burn it," he said coldly. The order passed quickly through his ranks. Soldiers gathered wood, brush, and olive branches from the nearby groves. The base of the tower was soon circled with dry kindling. Torches were lit, the flames dancing in anticipation. Inside, the people began to pray. Some wept, others sang psalms, and above them, at the highest point of the tower, the woman stood alone. In her arms she cradled her daughter. In her heart she cradled rage, not fear, not despair, rage. She had seen what he had done to Shechem. She had smelled the burning flesh. She had heard the laughter of soldiers as they set fire to innocents. She would not be another nameless victim. She turned and looked at the stone tucked near the grinding wheel. A millstone, small enough to lift, heavy enough to crush grain. Or a skull. She kissed her daughter's head and passed her to a young man standing nearby. "Take her down, keep her safe." Then she picked up the stone. Outside, Abimelech approached the base of the tower, holding a torch in one hand, axe in the other. He would light it himself, as he had in Shechem. The fire gave him power. It made him feel like a god. But gods don't look up. She did not scream. She did not curse. She simply watched. And then she let go before the siege. Thebez was a city built on stone and resolve. Smaller than Shechem, quieter than Jericho, it was a city often forgotten in the stories of conquest and kings. But its people were proud, carved from the same earth as their walls, resilient, firm, and patient. Nestled on the edge of the hill country, Thebez overlooked a dry plain where barley swayed in the wind. Olive trees bordered its slopes, their roots twisted deep into the soil. At its center stood the ancient tower, tall, rounded, and immovable. It was both a fortress and a storehouse, its foundations wide, its walls thick, and its history older than memory. The people of Thebez did not crave war. They farmed, they wove linen, they pressed oil from olives and ground grain into flour. Their children played in the courtyards. Their elders told stories by the fire. Their festivals were modest but full of joy. They were not warriors, but they remembered God. And they remembered the stories. She was known by many names: the widow, the miller's daughter, the one with the quiet voice. Her real name was used rarely, and not at all after her husband died in the last skirmish with bandits from the east. She had no sons, only a daughter, Nessa, whose hair was like spun wool and whose laughter once filled the narrow streets. They lived near the tower, close enough that the constant turning of grinding stones had become background music to their days. The woman spent her mornings at the grindstone, turning wheat into life. In the evenings, she told Nessa stories of Deborah the judge, of Jael and her tent peg, of Miriam the prophetess, stories where women were not footnotes, but instruments of God's will. She had grown up hearing of Gideon, of his miraculous victories, and of the God who used ordinary people to shatter impossible armies. She had heard of Abimelech too, a dark echo of his father, but without his humility. When news of Shechem's destruction arrived, when smoke was seen in the distance, and refugees spoke of towers burning and people screaming, her heart turned cold. But not weak. She knew war was coming, and when it arrived, she would not run. The elders of Thebez met in quiet, sober assembly. Some wanted to surrender. Others wanted to send messengers to negotiate. But most knew there was no reasoning with a king who burned cities to the ground. They looked to the tower. It had stood against raiders, against drought, against plague. It would now stand against a king. The people began storing food and water inside its stone belly. Blankets, oil, weapons if they had any. The tower became a womb of safety and fear, cramped, crowded, humming with whispered prayers. The woman carried her child up the spiraling stairs. As others wept or trembled, she kept her eyes forward. She did not fear death. She feared silence. She feared being forgotten. 2 days before Abimelech arrived, she descended alone to the lower chamber of the tower. She ran her hands across the grinding stone, smooth from years of use. She touched the grain sacks lined against the wall, the remnants of peacetime labor now pressed into wartime purpose. And then she saw it, the millstone, the upper stone, heavy, solid, circular, meant to crush wheat beneath its weight. She lifted one edge, heavy, but not impossible. She knew. She didn't know how or when, but she knew. There would come a moment when her hands would not need bread. They would deliver justice. That night, a wind blew through the tower's narrow windows. The people slept uneasily. Children whimpered. Elders mumbled in prayer. Nessa curled beside her mother, unaware of what the morning would bring. The woman looked up through the slit of stone at the sky. No stars, only clouds. She did not ask God for a miracle. She asked for aim, for courage, for the strength to act when the moment came. And far off across the plain, torches appeared in the dark. Hundreds of them, marching like fireflies in formation. Death was coming, and so was destiny. Judges 9:50. The sound of hooves came before the sight of soldiers, low and rhythmic, like a drumbeat from the underworld. The people of Thebez felt it in their bones before they saw it. Children clung to their mothers. Men sharpened old blades with trembling hands. And atop the tower, a figure stood unmoving, eyes fixed on the horizon. The woman said nothing as the dust rose into the air, carrying with it the scent of burning wood and scorched earth. Abimelech was coming, and he was bringing hell with him. From within the tower, the people of Thebez waited. The space was crowded, yet silent. They had fortified the tower with food, water, and whatever weapons they could find, pitch, stones, bows that hadn't been strung in years. The tower's upper windows, small and narrow, overlooked every approach to the city. From the eastern slit, the woman watched as black banners rose in the distance. A column of armed men darkened the fields below, their armor glinting like teeth in the sun. Behind them, Abimelech rode, his warhorse snorting, its hooves striking the dry earth like flint. His helmet, fashioned from bronze and leather, bore the markings of conquest. His cloak, stained with ash from Shechem, still smelled of death. There was no messenger, no terms of surrender, no warning. Only the tightening circle of soldiers and the slow death marched toward the gates. The elders of Thebez gathered in hushed discussion. Some spoke of resistance, others of holding out until the king grew tired. A few wept openly, but there was no escape, no reinforcements, no miracle army rising from the hills. The woman sat near the highest point, her daughter asleep beside her. Her hands rested on the smooth stone of the millstone she had dragged with effort from the grinding chamber below. She remembered her husband's hands, strong but kind. He had died defending their fields, not with a sword, but with a pitchfork, not for glory, but for family. His blood had soaked into the same soil now being pounded by enemy boots. She wouldn't forget, and she wouldn't forgive. By mid-morning, Abimelech's forces had encircled Thebez completely. He did not waste time with siege tactics or diplomacy. He had razed Shechem in a day. He intended to do the same here. A battering ram, thick as a tree trunk, was rolled toward the gates. The first strike shook the walls of the city like thunder. The second cracked the beams. The third shattered them. The soldiers swarmed like locusts. The defenders of Thebez fought valiantly, but they were farmers, not warriors. They were fathers, not generals. They fought with tools, with kitchen knives, with broken spears from old wars. But courage could not slow the tide. One by one, the outer streets fell. The people fled, every man, woman, and child who could, into the tower, slamming shut its thick stone doors and barring them from the inside. Thebez had become a fortress, but a fortress without an army. Abimelech walked the empty streets, sword drawn. He passed shuttered windows, empty homes, and pools of fresh blood. He had burned one tower already. Why not another? He stood at the base of the tower and looked up. Faces stared back at him, pleading, terrified, defiant. It didn't matter. They were already dead. He turned to his captains. Bring wood, branches, anything that will burn. Within the hour, the base of the tower was surrounded with dry olive branches, fallen trees, and broken carts soaked in oil. His soldiers worked feverishly, laughing among themselves, stoking each other's bloodlust. Inside the tower, the air grew thick with the smell of pitch. The people began to panic. Some screamed, others prayed. A few beat at the walls, trying to dig through with bare hands. But the woman, she was still. While others huddled together, the woman rose. She pulled the millstone closer to the top window, a small circular stone used daily to crush grain. Its surface was worn smooth, but its weight was still deadly. She grunted as she lifted it, one arm at a time, muscle trembling beneath her robe. She had chosen her window. The narrow opening looked down on the base of the tower, where Abimelech himself had now approached, torch in hand. He wanted to repeat what he had done in Shechem. He would burn them all. She leaned against the stone, her forehead pressed to its cool surface, not out of fear, but focus. She whispered not to be saved, but to be used. God of Deborah, God of Gideon, God of justice, guide my hands. Then she looked out. There he was, so close now, barking orders, waving his sword, torch raised in his hand. He was proud, untouchable. She clenched her fists. Not today. Judges 9:51. The tower trembled, not from catapults or battering rams, but from the collective heartbeat of hundreds huddled inside. The people of Thebez, packed into the thick-walled stronghold, listened in silence as the sounds of war crept closer. The bark of commanders, the crash of wood, the sizzle of torch fire licking oil-soaked timber. Children whimpered. Mothers hushed them. Men pressed their backs to the stone, knowing they could not hold it if the flames reached high enough. There were no weapons left. The outer city had been lost. Their only defense was height, stone, and faith. At the tower's uppermost ledge, the woman knelt beside the window, fingers gripping the edge of the smooth millstone. Below her, death waited. Abimelech stood at the foot of the tower like a man staring at prey in a trap. He'd seen this before, the desperate final stand, the futile hope in stone walls, the soft pleading in the eyes of those who clung to life inside. He had burned one tower. He would burn another. He turned to his soldiers. Stack the branches higher. Some hesitated. My lord, one said, this tower is stronger, the walls higher. He roared. We'll burn the stone itself if we must. His face, once regal, was now cracked with soot, twisted with obsession. This was no longer about rebellion. It was about control. The fire would be his answer to every voice that dared oppose him. Near the entrance, men braced wooden beams against the doors, praying they'd hold. Women poured water from clay jugs onto cloth, covering the mouths of their children in case the smoke crept in too soon. But most looked upward, not to heaven, but to the woman who now stood atop the city, alone in her resolve. She hadn't spoken much since the siege began. She hadn't wept, she hadn't screamed, but her presence filled the tower like oil before a flame. Even the children sensed it, something unshakable in her. She rested the stone on the window ledge. The weight pressed into her arms, but she held it. She looked down. Abimelech had drawn closer, torch in hand, shouting to his men. The wood crackled around the tower base, embers dancing like fireflies caught in a storm. She took a breath. Time slowed. Everything faded. Noise, fear, uncertainty. All that remained was aim. One chance, one throw, one stone. She shifted her weight, gripped the millstone by its edge and whispered, "Let justice be done." Then she leaned forward and let it fall. It tumbled end over end, silent for a moment, then whistling through the air. Abimelech had just turned his face upward, maybe sensing movement, maybe drawn by instinct or fate. The last thing he saw was a blur of stone against the golden sky. The impact was sickening. The stone struck the top of his skull with a force that sounded like thunder, splitting flesh, shattering bone, knocking the tyrant king to his knees. Blood gushed from the wound. He collapsed, torch slipping from his hand. The fire had not consumed the people. It had turned on the man who lit it. Dazed, blood pooling beneath his helmet, Abimelech's eyes fluttered. He knew the blow was mortal. His breath came in rattling gasps. But pride, his oldest companion, still clung to his dying frame. He turned to his armor-bearer, a young man who knelt in horror beside him. "Draw your sword," he rasped. "My lord." "Kill mem," Abimelech groaned, "so they will not say, 'A woman dot killed mem.'" The soldier hesitated. "Now," the king shouted, though his voice cracked like dry wood. And so, with trembling hands, the armor-bearer obeyed. The blade pierced his ribs. The tyrant king fell, not to an army, not to a sword, but to the hands of an unnamed woman. The people heard the cries outside. They rushed to the windows. They saw the body, lifeless, surrounded by stunned soldiers. The torches were dropped. And so, with trembling hands, the armor-bearer obeyed. The blade pierced his ribs. The tyrant king fell, not to an army, not to a sword, but to the hands of an unnamed woman. The people heard the cries outside. They rushed to the windows. They saw the body, lifeless, surrounded by stunned soldiers. The torches were dropped, the siege abandoned. The enemy was broken, not in battle, but in shame. And above them, the woman stood at the window, her hands trembling, her eyes full, not of triumph, but of release. She said nothing. She didn't need to. Judges 9:53-54. A single stone had ended a reign of blood. Outside the tower of Thebez, Abimelech's army froze, watching their leader crumple to the dust like a broken idol. The king who had burned cities, slaughtered families, and crowned himself in fire now lay motionless, his skull crushed, blood leaking into the soil he once ruled. He had tried to silence the truth with one last command, "Kill me, so they won't say a woman did it." But it was too late. His sword might have taken his life, but the blow that ended his kingdom came from her hands, and every soldier saw it. Inside the tower, the silence cracked like thunder, and then came the roar, not of fire, but of voices. The people of Thebez, still packed within stone walls, burst into cries of shock, disbelief, and then victory. Their prayers had not just been answered, they had been answered in a way that no one could have imagined. A woman, a stone, a death that stopped an army. The elders looked to one another, stunned. Mothers wept, clutching their children. Men who had sharpened axes for a last stand now dropped them, awed by what had just occurred. The woman said nothing. She sat down beside her daughter and closed her eyes. Below, the army of Abimelech was unraveling. His captains shouted commands, but the spell had broken. Soldiers who once obeyed out of fear now backed away. "What now?" one of them whispered. "The king is dead," another said. "No, he was killed by a woman," said a third. "He told his armor-bearer to end him, but we saw what struck him." "Then the curse is fulfilled," an older voice muttered. "Jotham was right. The fire he lit has consumed him." Far back in memory, the lone voice of Jotham, the youngest son of Gideon, the only one to survive the massacre of Abimelech's 70 brothers, echoed again from the mountaintop. "If you acted in good faith, then rejoice. But if not, may fire come from Abimelech and destroy Shechem, and may fire come out from Shechem and destroy Abimelech." And so it was. The king had destroyed Shechem with fire, and Shechem in turn had destroyed the king, through a woman, through a stone. Prophecy fulfilled.